Well, you're probably well aware of it, but just in case you weren't, Robin Williams passed away this last week. And, it was interesting as all the news feeds and media were just kind of covering his death and his life and his acting career. One of the interviews that I saw with Robin Williams online was one in which he was talking about his struggles with depression. And in a very honest but a very open moment, this is what Robin Williams said about that. He says, there's sadness, but then there's hope. In other words, there's sadness for a little while, but I get through the sadness because I understand that there's hope. And wow, that is the encapsulated message of the story, chapter 17. There's sadness, but then there's hope. Let me give you some background here this morning. The title of this morning's message is The Kingdom's Fall. The Kingdom's Fall. If you were here last week, we studied in great detail about the northern kingdom and how it met its demise at the hand of the Assyrian Empire. To this week, what we're studying is the southern kingdom, Judah, and its fall at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. As you did your reading this week, maybe there were some things that were kind of confusing to you, some dates, some names, and it's always kind of confusing, I think, sometimes when we're dealing with the Old Testament prophets and the invaders and things like that. And so I want to clear some things up here today, which I hope will be of help. And so what I want to start with is the main characters of the story, chapter 17. There are really two main characters as we're talking about the story, chapter 17. They are named as Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They were prophets, and they would, as you would expect, give prophecies. I need to clear up some things about prophecy and what it entails exactly, because in our modern day culture, when we think of prophecy, we think of a foretelling of the future, normally. Well, prophecy with the Bible is, when prophets would give prophecy in the Bible, it was much broader than that. Sure, there would be times when they would give predictions about the future, maybe about impending punishment that was to come, or maybe some future blessing that God was going to give. So there's part of that. But just as frequently, prophets, when they would speak, they would challenge the people around them concerning their behavior and their conduct. And prophets were in the business of encouraging, criticizing, rebuking the kings of the day, the priests of the day, and even the people of the day. And as you read the prophets, whether it be major or minor prophets, one thing rings true. The prophet's message, as you read it, man, it's very stern. They weren't exactly what I would call gentle diplomats. They just kind of told it how it is. And oftentimes, prophets would use shocking language to kind of get attention and get people to wake up and be like, whoa. And so they would use analogies or certain language to show the seriousness of the situation that God's people were in. You see, God is passionate about his people, and the prophet's job was to reflect God's anger, but also God's love towards his people. And so chapter 17 talks first of all about two prophets, Jeremiah, and let's talk about him first of all. In 627 BC, he began his career as a prophet. Hey, have you ever had to be the bearer of bad news? And how did that work out for you? There were some things that maybe you had to share with somebody that you were kind of dreading, kind of not looking forward to. That kind of encapsulated Jeremiah's career. He was known as the weeping prophet. And it wasn't because he was crying all the time. The reason he was known as the weeping prophet was because his messages didn't exactly inspire smiles from people. The message that he had was of the gloom and the doom and the destruction, the future destruction of Jerusalem. And so because of his message, Jeremiah really was not that popular of a guy. People weren't exactly swarming to be around him. Well, then there was the prophet Ezekiel. And Ezekiel began his prophet career in 593 BC. Ezekiel was actually born in Jerusalem. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And he was going to grow up. He had plans to be a priest. But God had other plans. And so he became a prophet when he was 30 years old. And this is something that you need to understand. And as you're reading the Bible, this will help you understand it too. Ezekiel and Jeremiah were contemporaries. They were kind of prophesying, their prophet careers kind of overlapped. It kind of did at the same time. And so that's what you need to understand about those two. Well, what I want to talk to you this morning about is also the main places found in the story, chapter 17. The first place that I want to mention to you is really a nation or an empire. It was the nation and the empire of Babylon. Now, you can kind of see how big this entire empire was. And you see right here, I don't know if you can see that in the back very well, that was the capital of the Babylonian Empire. It was Babylon. And what they would do is you can see over here, here's Jerusalem, and that's going to be really significant a little bit later on. If you were here last week, we're going to talk, then you understand exactly what happened to the city of Jerusalem and the whole area surrounding Jerusalem. And the next picture that I'm going to show is actually a zoomed in picture of Jerusalem right here. Okay? This is what was known as the northern kingdom of Israel. This was the southern kingdom of Judah. Last week, if you were here, you knew that this once united kingdom, God's people who were so close, who were so united, were divided. They were divided into two separate kingdoms. So whenever you hear the kingdom of Israel, that is referring to the northern kingdom of God's people, okay? It was a larger kingdom than the southern kingdom. It consisted of 10 tribes that made up the 12 tribes of Israel. This consisted of 10. The capital city of the northern kingdom was Samaria. It was the best fortified city of Samaria. And last week, if you were here, then you remember this army that amassed itself and came in and was God's judgment upon the people of the north. It was the Assyrian army. They came in and just decimated Samaria, took all the people captive and took them back and made them prisoners and slaves. In fact, the northern tribe, those 10 tribes were kind of known as the lost tribes of Israel after Assyria came in and just kind of had their way with them. Well, Assyria, after they defeated the north, they had plans to come down here in the south to attack the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, whenever I say Judah, I'm always referencing the southern kingdom, okay? The capital city of Judah is Jerusalem. It was the biggest city. It was the biggest fortified city of the southern kingdom. So, track with me here a little bit. Northern kingdom's wiped out. It's gone. The Assyrians are making their way here to the south. They have plans to do to Jerusalem what they did to Samaria. And they would have done it, except had it not been for the king of the southern kingdom who prayed a prayer and asking God to save them. And God does. And God provided an angel of the Lord, it says, came through the army of the Assyrian camp and wiped out 185,000 soldiers of their army. And that was the end of the Assyrians. They turned tail and head home. They're done. They've had enough of that. So the only kingdom that remains is the southern kingdom of Judah at this point. Okay? Well, let's talk a little bit about some dates, because it's really important to talk about dates. Because what you need to understand is that Babylon is going to be the one who's now, 115 years later, is now the one who's threatening to come over here and attack Jerusalem. Okay? So it's 115 years after the northern kingdom has fallen. That's kind of where we find ourselves. We're going to talk a few little dates about some important dates. The first is 722 BC. And I tell you all of this, you're like, why are we going through all these dates? It's important to get these in mind, okay? And you're going to see how it plays a role in the New Testament as well. But in 722 BC, the northern kingdom, Israel, falls to the Assyrians, okay? So the next 3 dates that I'm going to give you all have to do with the Babylonians coming in, attacking Jerusalem, and they succeed, and they end up taking captives a lot of the people of the southern kingdom, Judah. Okay? In fact, in 605 BC is the first time the Babylonians are successful. They come to the southern kingdom, they take captive, they take prisoners, and they send them all back to Babylon. Next week, as you do your reading, you're going to read about Daniel in the lion's den. Remember all that? You're going to read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember that whole story, the fiery furnace? All of that takes place because those men were taken captive in the first exile of Judah. And so they are actually in Babylon when they're facing those things. Okay? That's going to be important. The second date I want to give to you today is 597. And it's the second deportation of Babylon, to Babylon rather. See, what had happened was, after the first deportation, the Babylonians said, okay guys, we're going to leave you alone, as long as you pay a tax to us. We'll let you be as long as you pay money to us. Well, the king of Judah didn't like that. It was a hefty fine. It was a hefty sum of money. So he decided he was going to make an alliance with the Egyptians. And they were like, hey, I'll pay you guys some money if you join our forces and you go attack and defeat the Babylonians. Well, word gets back to the Babylonian king. He didn't like that Judah was going to make an alliance with Egypt. So he comes back and he ends up taking captive 10,000 more people of Judah. And in the second deportation, he takes with him Ezekiel the prophet. So Ezekiel was born in Jerusalem, but he doesn't stay there very long. He ends up getting as a prisoner in Babylon. And so as we're reading his prophecies, as we're reading the things that he's predicting, he's actually a prisoner held captive in Babylon, and he's kind of prophesying to his fellow prisoners, okay, who are in Babylon. That's going to be important too. Well, now we come to the most important date in Jewish history. It's 586 BC. This is the official date for the fall of the southern kingdom. Jerusalem is attacked. The walls are burned. The temple is destroyed. Most all of the people are now taken prisoners back to Babylon. The only ones who remain are the extremely poor people. So how did this happen? How did we get to this place in history? Remember, God freed his people from being slaves in Egypt. He said, I don't want my people treated that way. They deserve better. They deserve to have their own land. They deserve the promised land. And so they lived in the land of promise for hundreds of years under the rule of kings like David and Solomon. So how did we end up here? Has God forgotten about his promises? Has he forgotten that he said that he would be faithful to raise up a Messiah out of his people? Well, here's what you need to understand this morning, that God is in fact a patient God. He had all kinds of warning signs that he was giving to his kingdom, to his children. Have you ever noticed that in life there are all kinds of warning signs? In fact, there are warning signs you're having a heart attack. You know those, right? What are some of the warning signs you're having a heart? Tingling sensation, numbness, maybe shooting pain, shortness of breath. Those are all warning signs that something serious is about to happen. We have warning signs telling us that trains are coming. There's even warning sign on every pack of cigarettes that you smoke. There's a warning sign even on your vehicle's dashboard that warns you when you're about ready to run out of gas. There are weather warnings, tornado warnings, winter storm warnings. What's the problem then? Well, here's the problem. Have you ever neglected a warning? How many of you guys have ever ran out of gas? Raise your hands if you ran out of gas on the side of the road. You thought, I could get there, just a few more miles, I can almost make it, right? Wrong, right? And you ignored the warning sign. Well, the problem is we are really good at ignoring the warning signs that come to us. And God's people are no different. They were given warning after warning, and they ignored it. In fact, you remember last week, don't you? God's first warning sign that he kept telling them, hey guys, be careful what you do, be careful how you act. It came with the fall of Israel, the fall of the northern kingdom. That should have been like a huge wake-up call. And been like, wow, God's serious. And it was for a while. But they didn't really change their behavior all that much. They would chase after false gods. And Jehovah God had enough. And so he allows then the Babylonians to come and knock on their door yet once again. I mean, it should have been a huge warning sign. It should have been a wake-up call. It should have been enough that the northern kingdom was taken prisoner, that the northern kingdom was defeated. That should have really changed some behavior, but it really didn't. Oh, it did for a while. King Hezekiah was the one who prayed that God would save them, and the death angel goes through the Assyrian camp, wipes out the Assyrian army. They flee, and they're saved for a little while, for about 115 years or so. But then King Hezekiah's son takes the throne. His name's Manasseh. Now he had to have known or hear the stories about the Assyrian siege on the southern kingdom. He had to know that that was taking place. He had to hear the stories of his father praying and how he served the one true God. You'd think Manasseh would have learned the lessons. But no, in fact, what we read about Manasseh is quite contrary to that. If you have the story with you, you can open it up to 321, the second paragraph. Or if you have your Bible, you can open it up to 2 Kings chapter 21. We're going to start in verse 2, because verse 2 describes everything that you need to know about Manasseh. It says this: "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations of the Lord, the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites." So what that basically is saying is that Manasseh was so wicked, he was so evil, he did so much more evil than even the inhabitants living in the land that God commanded Joshua to get rid of. He was worse than the Philistines. He was worse than the Canaanites. This king had led his people, God's children, down paths that they never should have been led. In fact, listen to the evil that Manasseh did, verses 3 through 9. "He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, 'In Jerusalem I will put my name.' In the two courts of the temple of the Lord, Manasseh built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed even his own son in the fire. He practiced divination, sought omens, consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing God's anger." Verse 7. "He took the carved Asherah pole and he made it, and he put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, 'In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not again make the feet of the Israelites wander from the land I gave their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them and keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them.'" Verse 9 is a narrative, the saddest verse of the nation of Israel at this time. "But the people did not listen. Manasseh led them astray, and so they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites lived in the promised land." You see, God had warned them time and time again, "Hey guys, correct your behavior, change your behavior. If you're faithful to me, I'm going to bless you. You'll be blessed." But they ignored that warning. And so God decides to give them one final warning. Enter Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem. He was a prophet called by God, and he spent his entire life giving all kinds of warnings that Jerusalem was in deep trouble if they didn't change their ways. And God was using Jeremiah to deliver a pretty harsh message to his people. Listen to his warning that he gives in Jeremiah chapter 2, starting in verse 4, verse 9, verses 11 through 13. It reads, "Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, all you clans of the house of Israel. I will bring charges against you again, declares the Lord. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they're really not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glory for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, O heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they've dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that can't even hold water." You see, the people of the south had changed gods. They exchanged Jehovah God, the one who brought their ancestors out of Egypt. They exchanged that God for the false gods of the Baals. And God was not happy with that. I love the language that Jeremiah uses here. He uses an analogy of water. He says, they have betrayed the spring of living water. Who's the spring of living water? It's God. Water is needed for life, and God, Jehovah God, is the only one who can grant life. They've betrayed the spring of living water. They've forsaken God, and they've tried to get water on their own by digging their own cisterns. And that didn't end well for them. You see, what happened here is the southern kingdom, they decided for themselves what was right and what was wrong. They called evil good. And it's hard to get any plainer than the warning that God had given them, but still the people did not heed the warning. Still the kings went from bad to worse. They did evil in God's sight. Well, here's the application that we need to pause and make here today. What's your warning sign that God has given you? Has there been some sort of warning in your life something going off where God is like, warning, pay attention, what's about to happen is going to end horribly for you if you continue down this path. Maybe it's happened in the quiet moments of your life. Or maybe it's happening right now as the preacher brings it up in a sermon. Would you be able to be honest enough to admit to yourself that there are some warnings that God would have for you? Maybe it's your anger. Maybe you find yourself not having enough patience and just flying off the handle at the little things, the things that didn't used to irritate you, but now, man, you're just mad and you're just going off and you're taking it out on people who don't even deserve it, who didn't do anything wrong. Maybe your spouse or your children. And maybe they avoid you. Maybe they're fearful of you. That should be a warning sign that something needs to change. Or maybe you watch television and you see people brag about the amount of liquor they can drink. Maybe that should be a warning sign for you that you drink too much, that maybe you need to stop. Or maybe God is warning you about the idols that are in your life. And see, in America, we think, oh, idols, well, that's kind of like a third world country problem. You know, they create little statues and they bow down to these little statues. That's like the village people, you know. That's kind of like the thing of third world countries. I'm telling you, in America, we don't serve little statues we make, but we serve idols. We worship idols. We worship sports, we worship fame, and we worship money. Those things right there are the American idols that we bow down to. You see, an idol is anything or anyone that you put before God, that takes priority or precedence above God. And so money is definitely an idol that we worship here in America. Jesus told the story of the rich young ruler. This rich young man came and asked Jesus what he had to do in order to receive eternal life. Jesus told him to give away his money. And you know how the story ends. The rich young ruler went away sad. Why? Because he had a lot of money. His money was more important to him than eternal life. And maybe there's some things in your life that you care more about than eternal life. It's an idol. Well, I come back again to the question, what's the warning sign in your life that God is telling you about? What is it that you need to kind of put in check, to kind of take care of? Well, fast forward with me now. The year is 586 BC. The Babylonians have done what the people never thought would be done. Jerusalem is destroyed and people are taken hostage. Jeremiah flees and goes to Egypt where he lives out the rest of his days. Not exactly a happy ending for God's children, taken as prisoners, taken as spoils of war. But that's not where the story ends. We now turn our attention to the message of hope. You see, even though God's children were disobedient, even though they needed punished, even though they had forsaken God and turned their attention to other gods, and even though they were faithless to God, God remained faithful to them. God never gives up on his kids. His love never ends. They are still his kids. And God's going to declare to them a message of hope through the prophets Ezekiel and also Jeremiah. But I want to talk specifically to you this morning about Ezekiel. So Ezekiel was taken prisoner from Jerusalem in the first Babylonian exile in 597. And in 593, he begins to prophesy. He begins to deliver a message to his fellow prisoners. So Ezekiel has been in Babylon now for 11 years when Jerusalem is finally destroyed and everybody else is taken prisoner and brought back to Babylon. And so while Ezekiel is in Babylon, God tells him to do some pretty strange things. But everything that God has told Ezekiel to do is a symbolic message to his fellow prisoners. For instance, God tells Ezekiel to sleep on his left side. No tossing and turning. Sleep on your left side for 390 days. Why? 390 days was a symbol. It showed and represented the 390 years of suffering of God's people. God then tells Ezekiel to turn over and sleep on his right side for 40 days. Why would he do that? To symbolize the 40 years of suffering that the southern kingdom, Judah, would endure. Not only that, God tells Ezekiel to shave off all of the hair of his head, and he weighs it. And as he shaves off all the hair of his head, only a few strands of hair remain on Ezekiel's head. Again, that was a symbol that only a remnant of those who were taken captive into Babylon would remain, would actually get to return to Jerusalem. But Ezekiel's main message of hope comes in the latter chapters of his book. In Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, God gives him a vision. And the vision that he's given is the vision of the temple. You mean the one that the Babylonians destroyed? Yeah. Only this time, God says it's going to be rebuilt. And it's going to be back in Jerusalem. And his people would worship him there again in the temple. You talk about a message of hope. That's huge. What I love about Ezekiel's message and the message that Jeremiah would later give is this: God is faithful. God is faithful. We just have to wait for it. We just have to wait for it. You've heard me say this, and I hope this is a phrase that sticks with you long after I'm gone. I hope this phrase that you can repeat on your pillow at night. God is never late, but he's rarely early. Right? God's never late, but he's rarely early. And it may have seemed as though God had forgotten about the promises of his people. It may have seemed like God was done, like he washes his hands and he steps away from them. But I'm telling you, God is faithful. Wait for it. In your bulletin insert, you may have noticed that I left out the last date of the main dates listed there. It's an important date. It's 539 BC. What happens in 539 BC? Well, God's faithfulness and God's promises are once again made known because the Babylonian Empire comes to an end in 539. And it's the beginning of the Persian Empire. And the new king, King Cyrus II, gives the decree for the Jews to now return to Jerusalem. And that's something that Jeremiah had spoken about in Lamentations chapter 3, verses 20 through 23. It reads, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Really, you have hope, Jeremiah? What's your hope? Why do you have hope? Verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. You see, even though the people of the southern kingdom had not heeded God's warnings, even though they were prisoners and held captive, even though they wouldn't listen, even though they had turned their affections and their attentions towards other gods, God was still faithful. He was still faithful to fulfill his prophecy, his promise that a Messiah, who we would know as Jesus the Christ, that he would come out of that southern kingdom of Judah. God was faithful that in his desire, that he had such a deep desire for people that he wanted to bring people back in relationship with him. God was faithful that he would love these people with an unconditional type of love. And so one last question I have for you this morning is this: what does God's faithfulness mean to you? For the people of Judah, it meant, restoring of the temple. It meant that we were not forgotten, that we would be restored, that we would have a part in God's history. But what does God's faithfulness mean to you? What does it mean for you that God is always faithful to you? What would God's faithfulness mean when he says, there's no sin too great for me to forgive? What would God's faithfulness mean when he says that he would work all things together for good for those who love God and for those who are called according to his purposes? What would God's faithfulness mean that your God would desire to be with you for eternity? That's good to hear. God is faithful. His warnings, even though people ignored the warnings, even though people refused to give heed to what God would say, God is faithful. Why? Why is he faithful? Why is he faithful to me even when I have not been faithful to him? Here's why. Because he loves you. God has done everything in his power to spend eternity with you. He loves you and cares for you that much. His love is demonstrated for you in Jesus Christ. I love the words to the old hymn It reads, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As you have been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me."